We've all seen tons of horror movies that come labeled with that fearful tagline based on a true story. Whether that information is factual or just a marketing ploy, one thing is for certain. It catches your attention. It draws you in. That's why it's there. But out of all of those movies, which ones are the best? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. So join me as we look at my top 10 horror movies based on a true story on this episode of Ranking Rumble. Welcome back to WWH. My name is Andrew Dreamer. Now, we all know that when a movie claims to be based on a true story, the accuracy of that claim can vary greatly depending on the story. Oftentimes, what filmmakers and writers will do is take a small detail and build a story around that detail. Other times, they take other creative liberties in order to flesh the story out or simply make it more compelling. While this may seem disingenuous in some ways, I do think that it is necessary most of the time. Of course, that's just my opinion though. Now, as we get into the ranking, I will be taking some creative liberties myself, just like some writers do. And you'll understand what I mean once we get going. But I would also like to say that I'm only including movies that I have actually seen. So if something that you love is not on my list, it's possible that I just haven't seen it. So I would just ask that you give me some recommendations down in the comments on some other movies that are based on a true story that I should watch. On that note though, it is almost bell time, but before we get there, be sure to body slam that subscribe button and drop kick that like button as hard as you possibly can so you never miss any of the chill-inducing, hard-hitting 5-star matches we have here at WWH. Alright, grab your popcorn and make your way to your seat. Let's head down to the ring. Starting us off at number 10 is Wolf Creek, released in 2005. Wolf Creek is the kind of horror film that feels sunburnt and dehydrated. Directed by Greg McLean, it follows three backpackers who venture into the vast Australian outback and cross paths with a local man whose friendliness quickly turns into something far darker. The film moves at a patient, almost documentary pace at first, letting the landscape breathe. The outback is not just a setting, but a silent accomplice, endless and indifferent. Obviously, being marketed as based on a true story makes this film linger in your mind. While the specific story and characters are fictional, McLean drew inspiration from real Australian crimes. Most notably, the backpacker murders committed by Ivan Milat in the 1990s, and elements of the crimes of Bradley John Murdoch, who was convicted in 2005 for killing British traveler Peter Falconio. Like the film's antagonist, these real-life killers targeted travelers in remote areas, exploiting isolation as a weapon. The result is a film that blurs the line between urban legend and headline. By rooting its terror in recognizable history, Wolf Creek trades in a particularly unsettling currency. It suggests that the monster does not need fangs or a mask or anything like that. Sometimes it just needs a truck, a smile, and a stretch of road with no signal bars in sight. Next up at number 9 through 6, we have the Conjuring franchise. The order here doesn't really matter, so I'll just kind of go in order of release here. And I just mean the main series, the 4 Conjuring movies. We could talk about all of the other ones too, but to be honest, I haven't really seen them all, and I don't like most of them either. So I'd rather just focus on the main entries in this universe for now. It just kind of keeps things more efficient. The Conjuring franchise centers on real-life paranormal investigators Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren, blending haunted house horror with dramatized case files. The main films present themselves as being based on true events, drawing from the Warrens' most famous investigations and shaping them into some pretty effective cinematic nightmares. The Conjuring follows the Perron family in 1971, who claimed their Rhode Island farmhouse was plagued by a malevolent spirit. According to the Warrens' accounts, the haunting involved physical attacks and disturbing manifestations tied to the home's history. The film dramatizes these reports, heightening these supernatural elements while grounding the story in the family's testimony and the Warrens' case files. The Conjuring 2 then shifts to the Enfield poltergeist case in late 1970s England. The Hodgson family reported furniture moving, knocking sounds, and their daughter allegedly speaking in a different voice. The real Enfield case drew massive media attention and skepticism, but the film portrays it as one of the Warrens' most intense and dramatic cases for sure. Now, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It focuses on the 1981 trial of Arne Cheyenne Johnson, the first U.S. murder case in which the defense argued demonic possession. The Warrens were involved in the real case and publicly supported the claim that Johnson had been possessed. The film adapts these events into a supernatural thriller that leans into the ritual and occult themes while keeping the core courtroom premise kind of in there as well. Now, finally, we have The Conjuring Last Rites that drew inspiration from the haunting of the Smurl family and that the Warrens investigated in 1986. Apparently, this case was on the filmmakers' minds for a pretty long time. Like the previous films, though, liberties were taken, scares were heightened, and the story was crafted into a solid closing chapter for this era of the Conjuring universe. Coming in at numbers 5 and 4 is the Amityville Horror. Once again, like I said, I'm taking some liberties here and including both the original film from 1979 and the remake from 2005. I like both of these movies, and which one I prefer kind of just depends on my mood on that particular day. So let's talk about them both for a little bit. The 1979 version is a slow burn supernatural thriller based on the 1977 book by Jay Anson, which claimed to recount true events. The story follows George and Kathy Lutz, who move into a Long Island home where 1 year earlier Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered 6 members of his family. In the film, the house itself seems infected by an evil presence, gradually influencing George's behavior and subjecting the family to terrifying paranormal events. The tone is eerie and restrained, leaning heavily on atmosphere and psychological dread. The 2005 version is a remake that retells the same basic story, but with a more modern, intense approach. Starring Ryan Reynolds as George Lutz, the remake amplifies the violence and visual horror, portraying George's transformation as more overtly threatening and physically dangerous. The 2005 version also leans more into jump scares, disturbing imagery, and a darker, more aggressive tone compared to the subtle unease of the original. The true story behind both films began with the real-life 1974 murders committed by Ronald DeFeo Jr. in Amityville, New York, like I said. After these killings, the Lutz family moved into the house and later claimed that they fled after 28 days. This was allegedly due to violent hauntings, including strange odors, cold spots, apparitions, and George's personality changes. While the Warrens publicly supported the haunting claims, investigations and later legal proceedings raised some pretty serious doubts, and many critics and participants have suggested that the story was exaggerated or outright fabricated, and that happens to be my opinion as well. One thing is for sure though, the story certainly made for 2 very good films. The main difference between the 2 films lies in style and emphasis. The 1975 version focuses on creeping dread and ambiguity a lot of the time, allowing the viewer to question whether the horror is supernatural or maybe if it's more psychological. The 2005 remake is faster paced and more graphic, absolutely. It presents the haunting as more explicitly demonic and visually terrifying. Both, however, rest on that same controversial foundation. A real mass murder followed by a haunting narrative that continues to blur the line between documented crime and disputed legend. Our number 3 entrant is The Town That Dreaded Sundown. This early slasher film from 1976 is something that I've actually sort of recently revisited and looked deeper into the story behind it. And to be honest, this is one of those movies that I would like to see get a little more recognition. Obviously, it's not that obscure, but I do believe that it gets forgotten sometimes, and to me, that's a shame. The film itself was directed by Charles B. Pierce. Blending procedural storytelling with slasher elements, the movie recounts a series of attacks on young couples in Texarkana. Its gritty tone, on-location shooting, and use of a narrator give it a true crime atmosphere, making the violence feel uncomfortably real rather than purely cinematic. The masked killer in the film, known as the Phantom, stalks lovers' lanes and terrorizes the quiet community, creating a sense of paranoia that spreads beyond the immediate victims. The story is based on the real-life Texarkana moonlight murders that took place in 1946 and around Texarkana. During that spring, an unidentified attacker assaulted several couples parked in secluded areas, killing 5 people and seriously injuring others. The killer, often referred to as the Phantom Killer, was never identified or definitively caught, though suspects were investigated. The lack of closure and the randomness of the attacks left a lasting scar on the community, with residents reportedly arming themselves and imposing informal curfews out of fear. The film dramatizes these events, altering details and heightening certain aspects for suspense. But it does keep the core facts intact. A masked assailant targeting couples at night, a town gripped by fear, and a case that remains officially unsolved. That unresolved history is what gives this movie its lingering power. Unlike fictional slashers with clear endings, this story closes with the unsettling reminder that the real Phantom was never brought to justice, leaving the legend to be just as scary as the fact. Coming in at number 2 is The Strangers, released in 2008. Before I dive into this one, let's just all agree to ignore that new trilogy and forget about it. Deal? Great. So, The Strangers is a stark, stripped-down home invasion thriller directed by Brian Bertino. The film follows a young couple staying in a remote vacation house who are terrorized by 3 masked intruders. What makes this movie so unsettling is its simplicity. There's no elaborate motive, no backstory explaining the attackers. The violence feels random and senseless, underscored by the chilling line of, "Because you were home." The quiet pacing and isolated setting amplify that sense of helplessness, making the horror feel disturbingly plausible. While not based on a single documented case, the film was inspired by real events from Bertino's childhood and by broader true crime incidents. Bertino has said that when he was young, strangers knocked on his door asking for someone who didn't live there. Later, he learned similar knock and ask tactics had been used to target empty homes for burglary. He also cited crimes such as the notorious Manson family murders, where victims were attacked in their homes without personal connection to the killers. The randomness and lack of clear motive in those crimes influenced the film's tone. Rather than recreating a specific case, The Strangers draws its terror from the idea that violence can be arbitrary. By grounding its premise in real-world fears, isolated houses, masked intruders, and criminals who choose victims simply because they are there, the film blurs that line between fiction and possibility. Its true story roots lie less in headlines and more in the unsettling reality that sometimes there is no reason at all. Our final entrant today is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. That's right, the OG TCM is my favorite horror movie based on a true story. Though this one definitely takes a lot of liberties, but that's fine with me because it sure as hell works. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a raw, relentless horror film directed by Tobe Hooper. It follows a group of young friends traveling through rural Texas who stumble upon a decaying farmhouse inhabited by a family of cannibals. The most infamous member of the family is, of course, Leatherface, the masked killer who wields a chainsaw and wears masks made of human skin. Shot with a gritty, almost documentary feel, the film relies more on atmosphere, sound, and suggestion than graphic gore. This makes the violence feel disturbingly real. The movie famously opens by claiming to be based on a true story, but that statement is only slightly accurate. Leatherface and the cannibal family were partly inspired by Ed Gein, a Wisconsin murderer and grave robber arrested in 1957. Gein exhumed corpses and fashioned household items and clothing from human remains, including masks made of skin. However, unlike the film's portrayal, Gein acted alone and did not use a chainsaw or target groups of stranded teenagers. Hooper drew from Gein's crimes as a starting point and then expanded the concept into a fictional nightmare. Now, obviously, we all know this information by now. It's not news to anyone who follows horror. I mean, hell, they just made the entire show on Netflix about Ed Gein, so it's not new to anybody at this point, but I still wanted to point it out. By marketing the film as a true story, Hooper amplified its shock value, making audiences question how much of what they were seeing was actually real or could have actually happened. In reality, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is more myth than fact, blending fragments of true crime with social anxieties of the late 1970s, economic decline, rural isolation, and cultural unrest. The mix of gritty realism and exaggerated horror is what helped cement it as one of the most influential and unsettling films in the genre. And a lot of people still consider this film to be one of the scariest movies ever made. Though for me, I think it's more disturbing than scary, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I just mean that it's extremely effective. But there you have it. Those are my top 10 favorite horror movies based on a true story. Let me know down in the comments what you think about my list, and also leave me some recommendations for other movies that tout this claim. And while you're there, go ahead and check out some of the links that are down in the description as well. I appreciate you all for joining me today and putting up with me for a little while. It truly does mean the world. Now that we've talked about some horror movies based on true stories, what horror movies did you maybe not know were based on true stories? Luckily, you can find out by watching the video that's appearing on your screen now. And remember, in the squared circle of horror, there are no countouts for nightmares. My name is Andrew Dreamer, and this is Wrestling with Horror.